Thank you for listening to our audiobook channel. Please subscribe if you have not already. The new releases twice weekly. And now, for the feature presentation, The Parrot's Last Witness. Chapter 1, An Invitation to Mourn. The morning fog still clung to the cobbled streets of London when Detective Jane Parsons returned home from her morning stroll along the Thames. Her boots were speckled with dew and soot, and her cheeks bore the faint flush of spring's chill. She had just set the kettle on the stove and opened the Morning Post when her fingers paused on a curious envelope, thicker than the others, sealed with crimson wax and bearing the faint scent of lavender. Her name was inscribed on it in a precise, elegant hand: Miss Jane Parsons, investigator of discretion and repute. With practiced calm, Jane slid her letter opener beneath the seal and unfolded the letter inside. Elderhurst Manor, Devonshire, April 6, 1904. Miss Parsons, I must entreat your assistance with a most distressing matter. My brother, Colonel Bertram Harwood, was found dead in his study 2 nights ago. The coroner has ruled it a suicide, but I am convinced something far more sinister occurred. He would not have taken his own life, not Bertram. There are details the police have overlooked, or perhaps deliberately ignored. I shall say no more in writing, only that I am prepared to offer a most generous fee for your time and presence at Elderhurst. Please come at once. I await you in mourning and in hope. Yours faithfully, Lady Margaret Tilling. Jane read the letter twice, then laid it flat on the kitchen table beside her teacup. She had heard the name Harwood before. Colonel Bertram had once been a decorated officer of the King's Army, known both for his gallant service in India and for the occasional feature in society columns, especially those concerning eccentric hobbies and vast collections of antique weaponry. Her mind ticked over the details: a country estate, a well-known figure, a death labeled suicide, but doubted by the family, and a summons not to the police, but to her. Jane had long moved in the periphery of the wealthy and elite, taking cases they preferred, kept out of courtrooms and public record. Discretion was her most valuable currency, and a woman like Lady Margaret Tilling, elegant, widowed, connected, would not summon a private investigator lightly. She rose from the table and crossed to her desk, pulling out a small black notebook. After a few quick jottings and a check of her calendar, she packed a small valise, tucked her pistol discreetly into its velvet case, and donned her traveling coat. Within the hour, she was aboard a train bound for Devonshire, the countryside rolling past her window in great smudges of green and grey. It was dusk when she arrived at Elderhurst Station, a lonely platform flanked by moorland and whispering trees. A liveried footman, stiff-backed and silent, awaited her with a dark green motor car. The drive to Elderhurst Manor was long and winding. Fog clung to the hills, and the sky glowed orange through the thinning clouds. The manor came into view gradually, its gables and towers emerging high in the sky. It was vast, ivy-draped and mournful-looking, its tall windows flickering with candle light. The air was rich with the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. The door was opened by an elderly butler, with hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too many secrets. Miss Parsons, I presume. Lady Margaret is expecting you. This way, please. He led her through a grand hallway, lined with oil portraits and Persian rugs, to the drawing-room, where a fire crackled and a figure sat near the hearth, swathed in mourning black. Miss Parsons, said the woman, rising, thank you for coming. I am Lady Margaret Tilling. She was in her late 50s, with silver hair pinned neatly beneath a veil, and a composure that hinted at strength beneath sorrow. Her gloved hand trembled only slightly as she gestured for Jane to sit. I suppose you'll wish to hear everything, Lady Margaret began, pouring a small glass of sherry for her guest and herself. I do not trust the Devon constabulary. They dismissed it at once. A revolver in his hand, the door locked from the inside, and a note scrawled on the blotter. But it's nonsense. Bertram could not do such a thing, not without writing me a letter, not without putting his affairs in order. There was something wrong about the scene. Was he troubled recently? Jane asked gently, sipping the sherry. He had his moods. Who doesn't after war and loss? But not despair. He was proud, stubborn and secretive, yes, but he was not broken. And she hesitated, her eyes darkening. There's more. The study was warm, far too warm. The fire had been stoked unusually high. And the parrot? Jane blinked. The parrot? Yes, Percival, he's Bertram's. Talks more than most people, but since the night of the death, he's been saying something peculiar, something I can't quite make out, but it isn't something he used to say. He was in the study with Bertram until the butler moved him. Jane made a mental note. Lady Margaret stood. Please, stay as long as you need. I've prepared a room for you in the East Wing. I've told the staff you're here to catalogue my brother's library for valuation. It's best they do not suspect your true purpose. And the others? Jane asked, standing as well. You'll meet them at breakfast tomorrow, Lady Margaret said, her voice tight. The rest of the household, I'll let you form your own opinions, Miss Parsons, but do be careful. One of them, I believe, is lying. Jane gave a single nod. Then I'll begin in the morning. And as the butler led her upstairs through the dimly lit corridors of Elderhurst Manor, Jane could already feel it. Something had happened here. Something beyond grief. And somewhere in this house, the truth waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 2. The Secrets of Elderhurst Manor. The morning mist hung low over the grounds of Elderhurst Manor. From her bedroom window on the east wing, Jane Parsons watched the moor beyond the estate stretch endlessly under the pale grey sky. The silence of the countryside was stark compared to the hum of London, broken only by the occasional caw of a rook and the soft rustle of leaves from the orchard below. She dressed simply but smartly. A dove-grey skirt, high-necked blouse, and a fitted jacket. Pinning her hat into place, Jane tucked a small notebook into her satchel, along with a pencil and the letter from Lady Margaret. She preferred to observe before interrogating. Quiet footsteps often heard more than loud questions. Downstairs, the dining room was hushed, save for the clink of silverware and the rustle of newspapers. Lady Margaret presided at the head of the long table, like a queen in mourning, her expression unreadable behind her black veil. At her right sat a tall man with thinning hair and a permanent furrow in his brow. His cuffs were frayed, and his waistcoat hung a little loose on his frame, perhaps once a man of better fortune. To Lady Margaret's left sat a woman in her late 20s or early 30s, dressed in pale green with perfectly coiffed curls and a smile far too sweet to be sincere. Across from her lounged a man in his 40s with a heavy moustache and the ruddy complexion of one who either drank often or spent too much time in the sun. Lady Margaret gestured toward an empty seat. Miss Parsons, allow me to introduce the rest of the household. This is my nephew, Mr. Alfred Harwood. Alfred offered a curt nod. You're the one cataloguing the Colonel's books, then? Hope you've brought patience. He had no shortage of them. I rather enjoy old books, Jane replied smoothly, taking her seat. And this is Miss Clarissa Bainbridge, Lady Margaret continued, my brother's secretary and companion. She's been of great comfort these past few days. Clarissa leaned forward with an almost feline grace. How terribly sad to be examining his library without him in it. He spent hours there, especially with that bird squawking beside him. Ghastly creature. Jane smiled politely. I'm told the parrot has been saying some odd things. Clarissa waved a manicured hand. Oh, parrots always do. Mimics, nothing more. Bertram was always encouraging him, teaching him little phrases. He fancied the bird cleverer than most men. And this, Lady Margaret added, with a slight stiffening of her shoulders, is Dr. Lionel Vexley, our family physician and dear friend. Dr. Vexley offered a mild smile and rose briefly from his chair. A pleasure. I was quite fond of the Colonel, though our political views were divergent. I hope your time here is enlightening, Miss Parsons. I hope so too, Jane said, noting the pause before his final words. She took in his hands, steady, clean, a gold watch chain tucked neatly into his vest. Breakfast was a subdued affair, porridge, kippers, and hot tea served by a solemn maid named Agnes. Jane made careful note of each person's demeanor. Alfred spoke little and chewed like a man grinding his teeth. Clarissa was far too talkative, especially about irrelevant topics. Dr. Vexley deflected questions with medical wisdom and the occasional chuckle. Only Lady Margaret remained grave and composed. As the others left the table, Lady Margaret leaned closer. I suggest you begin with the study. The room was sealed after the police finished their investigation. Her tone sharpened faintly at the word. No one has been permitted inside since. I have the key. She placed a small brass key in Jane's palm. Thank you, Jane said. And the parrot. In the conservatory, where he usually stayed during the warmer months, the maid has been covering his cage at night. He squawks less that way. Jane nodded, tucked the key into her jacket, and made her way down the west corridor. The manor was a sprawling estate of thick carpets and high ceilings, the walls lined with ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed always to follow. She found the study behind a heavy oak door. Unlocking it, she stepped into the room that had last held a man's final breath. It was large, lined wall to wall with shelves, most filled with leather-bound books, many of them military history or colonial accounts. A map of India was pinned above the fireplace. A mahogany writing desk dominated the center of the room. The curtains were drawn, and the hearth was blackened with soot. Jane took in everything in silence for several moments. The revolver had been removed, no doubt retained by the police, but the blotter on the desk remained. On it was a short note in spidery handwriting. I am tired of fighting shadows. B.H. Jane frowned. Too brief, too poetic. Not at all in keeping with the record she had read of Colonel Harwood's brusque, military style. She circled the room slowly. The fire grate still bore grey ash, but something strange caught her eye. A faint burn mark near the hearthrug, slightly darker than the rest. She knelt to inspect it and found traces of wax and glass, as though something had shattered and melted in the flames. Her eyes moved to the shelf above the desk, where a single space stood empty, a clean gap among dusty tomes. She jotted in her notebook, empty shelf, missing item, burn mark, too warm a fire, and then, fluttering wings. From the open arch at the back of the study, a trail of light led into the conservatory. There, amid ferns and creeping vines, perched the infamous parrot in a brass cage. He regarded her with bright, beady eyes. "Hello, Percival," Jane said softly. The parrot cocked its head. "Pretty bird," she offered. "Liar, liar," the parrot croaked suddenly. "No flames, only the flask." Jane froze. The bird bobbed up and down, repeating the phrase with eerie clarity. "No flames, only the flask. Clarissa, no, no flames, flask." Jane's pen moved swiftly over her notebook. Whatever secrets this house held, one thing was clear. Someone had been overheard by the only creature no one ever listened to. And Percival, whether he knew it or not, might be the only true witness to murder. Chapter 3. The Locked Study. The rain began just past noon, soft at first, then steady, sheets of water sliding down the tall windows of Elderhurst Manor. Jane Parsons, notebook in hand, stood once more before the heavy oak door of the study. She locked it behind her this time, not for secrecy, but for silence. She needed to think, uninterrupted. The room was untouched since her earlier visit, dim, cold, and infused with the lingering scent of pipe tobacco, old paper, and something faintly chemical beneath it all. Jane crossed to the desk and began her methodical inspection. The blotter with the short suicide note still rested beneath the thick green glass paperweight. She carefully lifted it, examining the note beneath. The paper had no folds, strange for a man writing a final message. The handwriting was shaky, yes, but controlled. She examined the nib of the pen left behind. It had been wiped clean. That was unusual. Most suicides don't tidy up after themselves. Her fingers trailed across the open drawer of the desk. Inside were half-used sticks of sealing wax, old stamps, a box of envelopes, and, tucked deep in the back, a small black notebook. It was a list of military contacts, many names crossed out. The final entry, M. Beckwith, retired accounts, BDL, confidential. She noted it down. BDL, British Defence Ledger perhaps. Why would the colonel keep confidential military accounts now, in retirement? She moved to the hearth next. The fireplace still held soot, and in the far corner of the grate, she spotted a small glint of something foreign. Fetching the poker, Jane gently scraped it loose. A melted glass shard. She fished it out with a handkerchief and held it to the light. Pale green, curved, clearly from a flask or vial. The scent clung faintly to it, acrid and sweet, like crushed almonds and cleaning fluid. Arsenic, chloroform. She turned to the firewood basket. Empty. Odd, given that the fire had recently been lit so intensely. She scanned the shelves again, eyes narrowing on the uneven row near the empty space. A thin trail of soot curled up the wall from that point. Something had been removed and burned. She pulled a small folding mirror from her satchel and angled it toward the back wall of the shelf. There, on the edge of the book next to the gap, tiny smudges, as if fingers blackened by ash had gripped it. Someone had removed something in a hurry. Behind her, the wind rattled the window pane. She turned. On the far wall hung a framed photograph. The colonel in uniform flanked by two younger officers. One of them, she now realized, was the man at breakfast, Alfred Harwood, though younger and leaner. The other, unfamiliar. She jotted a note beside the name M. Beckwith. She turned next to the windows. They were locked from within, as was the study door. That much the police had confirmed. A classic locked room mystery, one with an obvious answer, but answers that come too easily often lie. She moved toward the far corner, where a tall grandfather clock ticked solemnly. At its base, an envelope had been tucked underneath, half hidden beneath the polished wood. She slipped it free. The seal had been broken. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for the heading, Harwood, Inheritance Revision, effective immediately. No signature, no date, no details. She raised her brows. If the colonel had been revising his will, who might it have affected? Alfred, certainly, perhaps Clarissa, if she'd hoped to be named in it. Even Lady Margaret might have motives, though Jane doubted it. And then there was Dr. Vexley, always present, always trusted. In her experience, those were often the most dangerous. She made her way back toward the study door, pausing to glance again at the blotter. "I am tired of fighting shadows," she murmured. Or perhaps someone was trying to cover theirs. Later that afternoon, Jane ventured into the conservatory again. Percival was grooming himself noisily, his cage beside a potted palm tree. "Hello again," Jane said, pulling up a small wicker chair. "Let's talk, shall we?" The parrot paused, then gave a delighted squawk. "Clarissa, no flask, no flames," it cried. Jane tilted her head. "Did you see something clever, bird?" Percival bobbed and chattered nonsense for several moments. Then, in a lower, mimicked voice, calmer, Raspier, as though recalling a different speaker, it repeated, "He'll never sign it, not unless we force his hand." Jane froze. That wasn't the same phrase. It was another. Different cadence. Different intent. "Who said that, Percy?" The bird gave a satisfied cluck and resumed preening. Percival had overheard not one, but multiple conversations. And now, one of those conversations revealed something the Colonel had refused to sign. Perhaps the revised will. She rose and made for the library, a grand chamber adjacent to the study. Row upon row of books stretched into dusky corners. There, she found a shelf of ledgers and legal records. On the third shelf, tucked behind a dusty law book, she discovered a brown folder marked Estate Drafts, Private. Inside were several revised versions of Colonel Harwood's will. One was signed, one was not. The unsigned version, dated just a week ago, removed Alfred entirely from the inheritance and added Miss Clarissa Bainbridge, £1,000 with annual pension. Jane exhaled slowly. Clarissa was being written in. Alfred was being written out. And someone wanted to force the Colonel to sign it. But the Colonel hadn't. And then, he'd ended up dead. She carefully replaced the documents and closed the file. She was beginning to understand that the Colonel had not died alone. Someone had watched him. Someone had waited. And perhaps the only creature who could name them had feathers. Chapter 4. Motives in the Drawing Room. Jane had spent most of the afternoon in quiet pursuit, making notes, sketching the layout of the study, and discreetly confirming the positions of rooms, doors, and windows throughout the house. But now, it was time to observe not just the scene, but the players. And there were three who intrigued her more than the others. The drawing room, where Lady Margaret had arranged for a pre-dinner gathering, was a richly appointed chamber of rosewood panelling and thick wine-coloured curtains. A fire crackled low in the hearth, and the soft strains of a Chopin nocturne drifted from a gramophone in the corner. Clarissa Bainbridge sat in an armchair near the fire, dabbing at her lips with a lace-trimmed handkerchief, though she hadn't touched her sherry. Her green silk gown shimmered when she shifted in her seat, a cat-like creature forever poised. Alfred Harwood stood by the sideboard, pouring himself a second glass of brandy, too early in the evening for it to be his first. His collar was slightly rumpled, his hair falling in uncombed waves over his brow. He wore the look of a man both anxious and impatient, as though waiting for something he didn't dare say aloud. Dr. Lionel Vexley, the physician, was by the windows, staring out at the misty grounds with the serenity of a man who had learned to enjoy his own silence. Lady Margaret, dignified and pale, sat at her embroidery frame, eyes lowered but ears unmistakably alert. Jane entered the room with quiet confidence, accepted the offered glass of sherry, and took a seat on the small chaise near the fireplace. "I hope your cataloguing went well," Lady Margaret said politely. "Quite well," Jane replied. "The Colonel's collection is vast and quite telling of his interests. Strategy manuals, accounts of the Raj, medical journals, even a treatise on poisons." She said it gently, sipping her sherry, but saw it, the flicker of reaction. Clarissa's fingers paused in their fidgeting. Alfred's grip tightened on his glass. Dr. Vexley turned slightly from the window, just enough to study her face. "Poisons?" Clarissa laughed lightly. "Surely you don't mean to suggest he was dabbling in anything sinister? He was always fascinated by morbid things, skulls, old battle wounds, that sort of thing." "Fascination doesn't make one a murderer," Dr. Vexley added with a chuckle. "But it does explain his lengthy discussions with me." Bertram could recount the symptoms of arsenic poisoning in more detail than I cared to hear. "Odd company for tea," Jane said mildly. "It wasn't tea. It was Port." Vexley smiled again. "And it was years ago." Jane let a moment of silence fall before she asked, "Would any of you say the Colonel had enemies?" "Enemies?" Clarissa looked up, eyes wide and lashes fluttering. "Everyone adored Bertram." "Not everyone," Alfred muttered, swirling his drink. "He was impossible at times, stubborn as a mule, and God help you if you disagreed with him." "Did you often disagree?" Jane asked. He gave her a sharp look. "I didn't agree with being cut out of the family affairs, if that's what you mean. He kept the estate close to me for years. After my father died, I was left to struggle in London while Uncle Bertram played country king." "You were mentioned in his will," Jane said evenly. "I was," Alfred snapped, "but that was years ago, before he brought her in." He gestured toward Clarissa with his glass. "Suddenly, I wasn't good enough to carry the family name." Clarissa stiffened, but said nothing. Lady Margaret's embroidery needle paused mid-stitch. "My brother had his reasons," she said quietly. "None that makes sense," Alfred retorted, "unless you think it makes sense to give away half the estate to a woman who's known him for all of what, 2 years? And what was she before that? A companion? A secretary? A pretty face to dress up the place?" Clarissa stood. "You overstep yourself, Alfred. I was his confidant, his assistant. He trusted me." Jane leaned forward slightly. "Did he tell you about a document he intended to sign, one that altered the inheritance?" Clarissa hesitated, just a flicker, but then nodded. "He mentioned it, said he was updating things, but he never showed it to me." Jane noticed how carefully she had chosen her words. "He never showed it to me. Not he never told me what was in it." Dr. Vexley turned from the window and walked slowly toward the hearth. "Bertram told me once he didn't believe in deathbed revisions. He said it made men weak, sentimental. He believed in finality. And yet, Jane prompted. Vexley sighed. "Yet he grew increasingly uneasy the last few weeks. Sleepless, paranoid. He told me once in confidence that someone in the house was spying on him, that papers had gone missing." Clarissa scoffed. "He misplaced things constantly." Jane raised her eyes. "Did he? I found no trace of disarray in his study. Everything was methodically arranged, except, of course, the space where something had clearly been removed from the shelf." The room went still. Alfred downed the last of his brandy and crossed to the decanter for more. Jane turned to Lady Margaret. "Was there anything you noticed the night of his death? Anything unusual?" Lady Margaret looked up slowly. "I remember the fire being too hot. He always complained of draughts, but that night, the room was stifling, as though he were trying to burn something." Jane glanced at Clarissa. "Did you see him that evening?" "I brought him his tea around 7, she said. "He was distracted, nervous maybe. He asked for a matchbox, even though there was one on the mantel. That struck me as odd, but he always had his peculiar habits." "And Dr. Vexley?" Jane asked. "I saw him briefly," the physician replied. "He called me to look at an old injury in his shoulder, said it was flaring again. That was just before dinner." Jane nodded slowly, storing away the timeline. She stood, setting her empty glass aside. "Thank you all. I've taken enough of your time for one evening." "Are you finished?" Clarissa asked quickly. "Hardly. I've only just begun." Jane offered a polite smile. "And so far, you've all been very helpful." That night, in the privacy of her room, Jane sat by candlelight, her notebook spread open. She scribbled, "Clarissa. Likely saw the new will. Was it unsigned? Was she pressuring him? Alfred. Angry, bitter, possible motive. But would he dare murder to reclaim the estate? Vexley. Intelligent, quiet, knows poisons, has access. Why did he claim Bertram was paranoid?" And at the bottom, she wrote in block letters, "Percival. No flames, only the flask, Clarissa, no. The parrot had said enough to cast suspicion, but not enough to condemn. Tomorrow, she would return to the conservatory, and then she would examine the medical supply cabinet in Dr. Vexley's private wing, because someone at Elderhurst had grown desperate. And Jane Parsons knew one thing for certain. This was not a suicide. It was a calculated, deliberate act, committed in silence and smoke, beneath the very eyes of a talkative bird no one had thought to listen to. Chapter 5. A Parrot Named Percival. The next morning Jane rose early, her mind still buzzing with questions and connections that refused to rest. She dressed in a dark navy skirt and cream blouse, pinned her chestnut hair back neatly, and walked briskly down the corridor, boots echoing softly on the polished wooden floor. Today, she planned to spend her hours with the most unusual witness she'd ever encountered. A parrot with a penchant for mimicry, and perhaps a memory sharper than anyone suspected. The conservatory was a long glass chamber at the rear of the house, a sun-drenched retreat filled with flowering vines, ferns, and the occasional orchid in bloom. But this morning, it was hushed, filled only with the scent of damp earth and the rustling sound of Percival shifting on his perch. "Good morning, Percival," Jane said, approaching slowly. The bird tilted its head. "Clarissa? No, squawk, no flask, Clarissa, no flames." Jane sat on a cushioned bench and took out her notebook. She had heard the phrases before, but repetition was important. Subtle changes in tone or wording might hold new meaning. "Tell me, Percival," she said gently, "what happened in the study?" The parrot blinked. Then, in a slow, drawling voice, quite unlike the squawking tone of a typical bird, it said, "He won't sign it, then we make him." Jane's pencil froze. That was new. Another sentence clearly mimicked. The voice, distinct, lower pitched than Clarissa's. Male, likely Alfred's. The parrot shifted again, fluffing its feathers. "Give him the flask, just a sip, he won't feel a thing." Jane's heart picked up pace. Her mind began mapping the timeline. Clarissa brings tea at 7 p.m. Dr. Vexley visits sometime before dinner. The fire was unusually hot, used to destroy something. Percival overhears more than one speaker, multiple people involved. She leaned closer. "Percival, what else? Did someone say your name? What did Clarissa say?" Percival tapped his beak, then in a high-pitched, panicked tone, not his own, he shrieked, "Clarissa, stop, don't, he's—" Then silence. Jane stared. That voice, desperate, breathless, female, Lady Margaret, a maid, or perhaps Clarissa herself. Whatever the case, the parrot had heard multiple conversations, multiple tones, fragments of truth scattered like puzzle pieces across days, maybe even weeks. "Good bird," Jane murmured. "Very good bird." By mid-morning, Jane's next task was clear. The medical angle could no longer be dismissed. If the colonel had not died from the gunshot, if he had instead been poisoned, then someone with knowledge of toxins and access to them must have been involved. She found the doctor in his private study on the south wing, a sunlit room filled with anatomical sketches, vials, and medical books stacked high. He was bent over a microscope, glasses perched low on his nose, and a pipe smouldering nearby. "Miss Parsons," he said, not looking up, "here to inspect the state of my bookshelf next." Jane smiled coolly. "Not quite. I was hoping for a word. Privately." He raised a brow but gestured to the seat across from him. "I've been thinking about the colonel's death," Jane said slowly, "and about something that doesn't sit right." "Only one thing?" Vexley chuckled, setting down his slide. He was a complicated man. Indeed, but not the suicidal type. The doctor's smile faded. "You're wondering if I missed something," he said evenly. I am wondering, Jane replied, if anyone had reason to make you miss something. He leaned back, studying her now with less amusement and more caution. That's an accusation. Number, just a consideration. Vexley crossed one leg over the other and lit his pipe with methodical calm. I examined the body, he said, smoke curling from his lips. There was no residue, no smell to indicate poisoning. The gunshot wound was clear, right temple, close range, instantaneous. And yet, Jane said, the fire in the study had been stoked hot enough to burn something completely, perhaps evidence. A glass vial. Percival mentioned a flask. The Colonel's handwriting on the note was uneven, out of character. His behavior in the final days, paranoid. You think someone drugged him? I think someone might have sedated him just enough to make him vulnerable, then made it look like he took his own life. Bexley sat silently for a long moment. I'll tell you something, he said at last. Something I didn't put in the report. She waited. The Colonel's pupils were constricted, not wide as you'd expect in a sudden trauma. Narrow, pinpoint. That can happen in death, yes, but it's also a symptom of alkaloid poisoning, belladonna, or opiates. Did he have access to either? Vexley glanced toward the locked cabinet at the far end of the room. I keep morphine for emergencies, locked, accounted for, but someone could have stolen a vial, Jane finished. He met her eyes. Yes. Jane stood and crossed to the cabinet. May I? Vexley hesitated, then fetched a ring of keys. He opened the cabinet, revealing neat rows of small bottles and ampules, labeled in his precise, spidery hand. She examined each carefully. One slot was empty. The label read, Laudanum, 1 dram. Who had access? Jane asked. Only myself, he said, and the Colonel on rare occasions. He had an old wound that troubled him in the winter. I once gave him a dose. And Clarissa? She asked. He didn't answer. Jane turned. Doctor? He sighed. She helped me with records once. I asked her to fetch a volume from the cabinet. I left the keys on the desk while I was out with a patient. It wouldn't have been difficult. Jane made a note. Do you believe she was close to the Colonel? Too close, perhaps, he said. He liked the attention, she liked the stability, but they were never equals, not truly. Did she have influence over him? Vexley exhaled slowly. He was preparing to name her in his will. I warned him it would cause trouble. And did it? I believe, he said carefully, it already has. Jane returned to her room. The pieces were starting to connect. Clarissa added to the will, possibly saw it unsigned, may have used laudanum to weaken or confuse the Colonel. Vexley, keeper of the laudanum, may have suspected her, but kept quiet. Alfred, likely furious at his exclusion, but too direct to stage a poisoning. Percival, the only witness who couldn't be bribed or threatened, who now mimicked damning phrases with eerie clarity. She opened her notebook and underlined her newest thought. Poisoned first, staged second, witnessed by a parrot. And then she wrote, if Percival heard Clarissa and another, who is the second voice? Alfred or Vexley? She stared at the page for a long time. Then she closed the book and whispered aloud, tomorrow, we test the truth. Chapter 6. The Flask in the Fireplace. The following day broke with a brittle chill in the air. Jane Parsons stood once again in the Colonel's study, the place where so much had begun, and where she suspected much had been hidden. She had already been here, of course, but this time she wasn't just looking for clues. She was hunting a very specific piece of evidence, one the killer had tried to reduce to ash. She lit a single lamp by the desk. The morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and grey, but Jane needed precision. She knelt beside the fireplace with a small wooden tray, brush and tweezers. Sifting gently through the cooled ashes, she worked slowly, methodically. Charred paper scraps, coal dust, a sliver of cork, and then a glint. She leaned closer, a curved piece of greenish glass, melted at one end, but unmistakably part of a vial or small flask. She placed it on the tray. Near it, something finer that looked like a string of fibrous material. She extracted it carefully. Pale grey, coarse, twine, or a wick? She paused. A memory returned, something Clarissa had said 2 nights ago. He asked for a matchbox, even though there was one on the mantel. Why would he need another? Then it struck her. Someone had staged the fire, not just to destroy the flask, but to make it seem as though he had burned something himself. The extra matchbox might have been planted or given to him under false pretenses. And what if? She returned to the desk and searched the drawers again. There, tucked behind a blotter pad, a spent match. Unusual. Why save it? She examined it under the lamp. The head was partially intact, but blackened unevenly. Jane sniffed it and caught a faint bitter scent. Laudanum again. The same strange sweetness from the glass shard. A matchstick dipped in laudanum would burn slower, but if used near a corked bottle. She jotted furiously in her notebook, vial with laudanum given to the colonel. Weakens him. Fire built up. Flask tossed into flames, destroyed, scene arranged to imply suicide. She underlined the last sentence. But the poison acted first, the gunshots second. Later that afternoon, Jane asked to see Lady Margaret privately in her sitting room, a richly adorned space of lace curtains, faded watercolors, and an antique pianoforte that hadn't been played in years. Lady Margaret, seated with her embroidery, looked up with sharp eyes. "I believe I know what happened the night your brother died," Jane said softly. The older woman set aside her needle. "Tell me." There was a fire in the hearth, unusual for that hour and season, too hot, too deliberate. It was meant to destroy something. Lady Margaret nodded once, gravely. The police thought nothing of it. I did. In the ashes, I found remnants of a green glass vial, the type used for laudanum or stronger narcotics. I believe your brother was drugged. Lady Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Good heavens! The dose wouldn't have killed him outright, Jane continued, just enough to make him disoriented, suggestible. Perhaps he was encouraged to write that short note under its influence. Perhaps he was even guided to it. And the gun? Placed in his hand later? Or perhaps he was too far gone to resist? Lady Margaret's face went white. "Do you know who did this?" "I have my suspicions," Jane said carefully, "but not enough to confront them. Not yet. Percival has mimicked several damning phrases, including your nephew's voice and Miss Bainbridge's." Lady Margaret stood, hands trembling. "Miss Parsons, I must tell you something." Jane watched her closely. 2 nights before Bertram died," Lady Margaret said, voice low, "I overheard an argument in the study. I was in the hallway. I dropped my knitting needle and bent to find it. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. But I heard Clarissa. She said, 'If you won't do it willingly, we'll have to make you.' Did you hear anyone else?" I thought I heard Alfred speak, but his voice was low, measured, cold, almost. I couldn't be certain." Jane nodded. "You heard the same phrase Percival repeated. He remembered it, clearly. But there's more. I believe someone else was present that night." "Who? Dr. Vexley?" Lady Margaret blinked. "Lionel? He has access to laudanum. He knew of the colonel's injuries, and—" Jane drew a breath. "He knew about the revisions to the will. He advised against them." Lady Margaret sat slowly. "He's been our family doctor for 20 years. "Precisely," Jane said. long enough to know every weakness and every threat. That evening, Jane asked Clarissa Bainbridge to join her in the conservatory. Clarissa arrived in a deep maroon gown, her expression wary but composed. "You summoned me?" she asked. Jane gestured toward the parrot's cage. Percival was quiet at the moment, preening. "I was hoping you could help clarify something," Jane said. "You brought tea to the colonel the night he died. Was that the last time you saw him?" Clarissa hesitated. "Yes, as I told you." Jane held up a small folded cloth. Inside was the melted glass shard. "This was in the fireplace. You wouldn't happen to know where it came from." Clarissa's eyes narrowed. "How should I?" "Because," Jane said, stepping closer, "Percival heard you say something. He's repeated it several times. He says, 'No flask, no flames, Clarissa, no.'" The woman froze. Then she laughed, brittle and high. "A bird? You're accusing me based on the ramblings of a bird." "He also heard another voice," Jane continued, "a male voice, saying, 'Give him the flask, just a sip.' And another saying, 'He won't sign it, then we make him.'" Clarissa's mask slit, her breath caught. "I don't." "Save it," Jane said coldly. "You were trying to convince him to sign the revised will, and when he refused, you panicked. You gave him the laudanum. You thought it would only sedate him, confuse him, but he grew too weak, or perhaps he passed out. You needed it to look like suicide, so you placed the pistol." "I didn't." Clarissa backed away. "And someone helped you?" Jane said. "Who?" Clarissa said nothing. Then from behind them came a voice. "I did." Jane turned. Dr. Lionel Vexley stood in the conservatory doorway, face pale, hands folded. "I told her it was madness," he said, stepping forward. "But I knew. I suspected she'd already begun. And when she ran to me in tears, I went to the study. I tried to stop her. But it was too late." Jane's voice was hard. "So you helped clean it up, arrange the fire, place the weapon?" "He was already dead," Vexley whispered. I couldn't see it all fall apart." "Fall apart," Jane snapped, "or be exposed." The parrot squawked, "Clarissa, no! Clarissa, no flask!" Vexley covered his face. Clarissa sobbed quietly, hands shaking. "You may have thought a locked door would protect you, that the fire would erase your tracks, but you made one mistake," Jane said. She turned to the bird. "You didn't silence the witness who never forgets a word." Chapter 7. The Parrot Cracks the Case. The following morning dawned unusually bright over Elderhurst Manor. Jane Parsons stood in the drawing-room, composed and razor-sharp, notebook in hand. She had summoned all the key members of the household: Lady Margaret, Alfred Harwood, Clarissa Bainbridge, and Dr. Lionel Vexley. The four sat in various states of tension, Alfred brooding by the mantelpiece, Clarissa pale and stiff in a high-backed chair, Vexley calm but silent, and Lady Margaret watching with weary dignity. And in the conservatory, just through the open double doors behind Jane, Percival the parrot perched in his gilded cage, feathers gleaming, his eyes sharp and unblinking. The witness, after all, had arrived too. Jane began calmly. "When I was first summoned to Elderhurst Manor, I was told that Colonel Harwood had taken his own life. A locked study, a pistol in hand, and a note on the desk. A classic case, on the surface." She looked directly at Clarissa, who avoided her gaze. But Colonel Harwood was not a man prone to despair. In fact, he was preparing to change his will, to reshape the future of this estate. He may have kept his thoughts guarded, but his actions were deliberate, and someone in this house knew they were about to be left behind. Alfred stiffened, but Jane held up a hand. "Let us consider the events of the final day." At approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, Miss Clarissa Bainbridge brought the Colonel his tea. I believe that tea was drugged with a potent dose of laudanum, just enough to cloud his mind, confuse his actions and weaken his body. Clarissa's lips parted, but no words came. Jane continued, turning toward Dr. Vexley. Doctor. Vexley later visited the colonel under the pretense of examining his shoulder, but he too saw the state the colonel was in, and instead of reporting what had happened, he chose to conceal it. Miss Parsons, Vexley began, but Jane cut him off. You didn't kill him, Doctor, but you helped someone who did. You advised the colonel not to alter his will. You stood by when Clarissa acted, and when you saw the damage was done, you helped stage the scene. You let her light the fire. You watched her toss the flask into it. You knew the only way to preserve your own reputation was to make the death appear voluntary. Dr. Vexley's face was grey, but he said nothing. Jane turned to Clarissa, who now clutched a lace handkerchief in her trembling fingers. You poisoned him because you feared being left with nothing. You had wormed your way into the colonel's life, into his will, but the final version, the one you needed most, remained unsigned. Clarissa's eyes glistened. I only wanted security. He promised me a life. But he changed his mind. He was going to revoke everything. So you gave him the flask, Jane said coldly, and when he grew too weak to resist, you and Dr. Vexley staged the suicide. You thought the fire would hide the truth, but you failed to account for one thing. Jane stepped aside and gestured toward the conservatory. Percival. The parrot gave a delighted squawk. No flask, Clarissa, no. Clarissa let out a strangled sob. I didn't mean for him to die, she cried. It was only a few drops, just to make him calm, just so he'd sign it. But he wouldn't. He fought me. Jane's voice remained even. And so you staged the suicide. I panicked, Clarissa whispered. He collapsed. I thought, maybe if it looked like he'd taken his own life, no one would ask questions, and Lionel helped. All eyes turned to Dr. Vexley. The physician removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. She came to me after it happened, he said quietly. Told me he was dead. I checked. He was gone. I should have gone to the police. But I thought of the scandal, of what it would mean for the family, for Margaret. I convinced myself I was protecting his legacy. Lady Margaret's eyes glistened with restrained fury. You betrayed that legacy the moment you helped cover it up. Jane nodded once. But there's one more matter to address. All heads turned. Jane walked slowly across the room and stopped before Alfred Harwood. You, Mr. Harwood, had every reason to hate your uncle. You were being erased from the will. You stood to lose everything. And yet, Percival never repeated your voice in any incriminating way. Why? Alfred blinked. Because I didn't know. Didn't know? I didn't know the will was being changed, Alfred said, suddenly raw with emotion. Everyone thought I did, but he never told me. He kept everything to himself. I thought I was already cut out. I'd given up. Jane studied him. I believe you. He looked stunned. I believe you argued with the colonel, but you never went further. You had motive, but not the cruelty. You were angry, but not desperate. By mid-morning, the local constabulary had arrived. Clarissa Bainbridge was arrested on charges of manslaughter and conspiracy to stage a death. Dr. Vexley, though not the killer, was taken into custody for obstruction and evidence tampering. Lady Margaret, though shaken, stood tall as the officers took them away. Alfred, silent and pale, walked out into the garden without a word. Only Jane and Percival remained in the drawing-room. She approached the cage and smiled at the bird. You did well, my friend. Percival puffed his chest and gave a small whistle. Clarissa, no, he chirped one final time. Then, as if satisfied, he fluffed his feathers and tucked his beak under his wing. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the manor returned to stillness, Jane packed her valise in the East Wing bedroom. Lady Margaret knocked softly at her door and entered. "You've brought the truth into this house," she said. "Whatever comes now, we owe it to you." Jane smiled faintly. "The truth was always here, Lady Margaret. It just needed a voice to repeat it." She glanced toward the open window, where the last light of day painted the moor in hues of bronze. "Sometimes," she added, "witnesses don't wear shoes or speak when asked, but they remember. And in the end, that's enough."